Welcome everybody to the Tourism and Hospitality webinar being presented by BVGV with CBRE, and I will introduce our two speakers this morning, and we're looking forward to receiving your questions throughout the webinar. So I'm joined today, and we are actually all in the same office, by Ken Atkinson, who's Vice Chair of the Tourism Advisory Board in Vietnam, founder and senior advisor to Grant Thornton, and is also a board member of the Bristish Business Group of Vietnam. Ken will be speaking first, and then we will be handing over to Nguyen, who is the Associate Director for Hotels at CBRE. We're anticipating this webinar, sorry, I keep saying seminar, this webinar to run to about 11:15, and we will be taking questions towards the end of the presentations. So I'll now hand over to Mr. Ken Atkinson. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. And we are sitting in the same office, and the office isn't big enough for us all to be 2 meters apart, but I think we're all pretty safe, considering the amazing job that Vietnam has done in containing COVID-19. So my agenda this morning, I'm going to do a quick outlook of the tourism industry, looking at security measures that we think will need to be taken in the future to get both domestic and international travellers on the move. Prediction on potential markets and tourism trends, which of course is a bit of a finger in the wind exercise at the moment, but and I'll finish with a couple of words about Grant Thornton. So tourism was and still is designated a spearhead industry, and that was in 2018, and on a broad basis it accounts for over 10% of GDP in Vietnam. And growth rates in the last 5 years have averaged 18% per annum for international visitors and 20% for domestic visitors. So in 2019, we had a record number of international arrivals at 18 million, and domestic travellers reached 85 million, which were growth rates of 16% and 6% respectively. In January this year, we had a record number of international arrivals again. In January, the number was just under 2 million, and a large number of those were Chinese visitors. So if we look at January to March, the numbers were not that significantly down. I mean, they were 18% lower than the previous the similar quarter in 2019, but we had 3.68 million international arrivals and 13 million domestic travellers. That was again, as I say, slanted because we had a record number in January of 2020. So put that graphically. Sorry. It's not in my slides. So anyway, so that's just showing the numbers graphically. So you see that we started off with a bit of a bang in January, and then the increase in February was not the downturn was not that significant. But as we get into March, we see a lowering of the increase, and then in April, of course, we were almost zero as the borders were all closed. And so the estimated loss in revenue between February and April 2020 was in the range of $6 to $7 billion US. The industry has been really badly hit, almost on its knees, I would say. A lot of hotels have been closed. Some of them, I guess, will not reopen. Some of the smaller properties, particularly, if you look around the old quarter in Hanoi and some of the mini hotels around Ho Chi Minh City, I suspect that quite a few of those will not reopen. And international hotels, they're running on average, I think, below 10% occupancy. Certainly in Ho Chi Minh City, places like the Hyatt and the Caravel, 14, 15 guests a day, and you can't run a hotel on those kind of numbers. So from April 23rd, the rays of light, or the green shoots, are starting to appear, and restaurants have reopened, as you'll all realise, hopefully, and retail outlets, and flights from Hanoi to Ho Chi Minh City in particular have increased from 2 flights a day to 2 flights a day per airline, I should say, to about 20 flights a day. And flights are running at about 82 to 85% of load capacity. We've got public transports resumed. There are 3 trains a day now from Hanoi to Ho Chi Minh City, or vice versa. Of course, we're still suffering from the fact that those high-speed trains take 24 hours to complete the journey, if they're lucky. Overseas Vietnamese are allowed to enter Vietnam, and of course, as we've seen, there's been a lot of Vietnamese returning home from overseas, particularly students and people working overseas that are no longer gainfully employed, and that's been adding to the number of new cases. But fortunately, all those people are in quarantine, so it's not impacting community spread, which for the last 33 days has been 0 in Vietnam. From May 7th, the airlines and public transports have been allowed to operate normal schedules. CAV is no longer controlling the airlines and the number of flights, and social distancing on airlines and in public transport has been relaxed and back to normal. The Vietnam Airlines have been talking about resuming some international flights from early June, but as yet we don't have any details on that. So the first driver for reboot of the travel industry in Vietnam is obviously going to be the domestic market, and this is something that's not new to Vietnam. We saw during SARS that whilst international arrivals fell, they only actually fell 8% year on year, but domestic travel has increased by 3.8% over that same period. I think domestic travel reboot will also be supported by the growth in the middle class, because this is something that's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take some time, depending on who you listen to. But some countries are saying they're not going to be allowing people to travel without going into quarantine for at least another year, and that of course will slow down the recovery. Vietnam's middle class is very strong. It's expected to reach 50% of the population by 2030. An average per capita income in 2018 was $2,800, and the average growth rate over the last 20 years has been 11% per annum. Interestingly, 2 out of 5 Vietnamese are now willing to spend discretionary spend on holidays. And as we've seen, the local market's always responded to sales promotions. And I think this is the key to the reboot of the industry. Thanks. So the major challenge, as I see it, will be the fear factor. And I think we saw that over the recent holiday weekend, where a lot of people were prepared to get on their bike or get in a car and drive to locations close to home. So if you're in Ho Chi Minh City, The hotels in Vung Tau did very well. Moi Nay did very well. But people were generally reluctant to get on aeroplanes and go through airports. And I think the work to be done there is really getting airlines and hotels to work together to offer attractive packages. Because as we know from historical events, that slashing hotel rates does not actually benefit anybody in the long run. So what will be the new normal as far as at least domestic in the short term? I think it's obvious that people are going to need to continue to wear masks and possibly gloves on public transport. Health forms are going to be needed for all air and public transport and hotels. Very important for contact tracing. Temperature checks at check-in at airlines, hotels, and we're seeing it in some restaurants in Ho Chi Minh City. A best practice code of conduct, which should be basically directed by the response team for COVID or the Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism, to be followed by hotels and restaurants. And there will need to be checks and compliance on those to make sure that people are abiding by the code of conduct. And that's the only way we're going to get confidence back into the consumers, and also to reduce this fear factor for traveling. There's going to need to be attention to deep cleaning and disinfectant of aircraft and hotel rooms. Not to say that neither of those weren't clean before, but it's going to be a different level of cleaning and disinfection that's required. So an action plan for international, through the Tourism Advisory Board, we've been having a dialogue with the government. And the first thing is that Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism have got a stimulus package called Vietnam Now to be implemented. And this is aimed at initially at domestic travellers, trying to get Vietnamese people to take their holidays in Vietnam. And later that will be shared with Asian and regional tourists. The ministry is proposing policies such as additional visa exemptions, visa fee reductions, increasing flights and opening new routes to some foreign countries when the global epidemic is under control. Of course, we're pushing for the reinstatement of the existing visa exemptions that were put on hold when Vietnam closed its borders. And we're also promoting what we're calling travel bubbles, which basically is a link between two countries that can show that they have the community spread totally under control. So, for example, Australia and New Zealand have got community spread totally under control, as does Vietnam, encouraging the two countries to open up a travel route where people can travel safely and they would not need to go into quarantine when they return to their home country. However, that takes governments from both sides to agree to this, and I think the Australians at the moment are showing a fairly steep resistance to opening their borders. Another initiative could be what I call quarantine holidays, and I haven't found a new word for it yet, but I did see somebody use the term safe haven holidays, which is essentially where you allow tour groups to come from a country that has got community spread under control, not necessarily eliminated, but that group of people will arrive. They'll be effectively quarantined in a resort. That's where they will spend their time in Vietnam, and that's the only place they will be allowed to stay. They won't be allowed to go out of that resort until they leave and are ferried to the airport. I think those are not pie in the sky solutions. Vietnam, of course, as I said earlier, has a tremendous record in containing COVID, and we need to get that out into the world community. I think it's very neglected in terms of international press, although I've seen a few more articles recently. But Vietnam has probably managed the whole COVID epidemic better than anybody else, and very few organizations or reporters refer to Vietnam when they're talking about the success stories. So that will, I think, help both tourism in the longer term and also foreign investment. So what are the challenges? So I think the biggest challenge for the government is going to be, when will they open their borders? When will they start to allow the resumption of international flights? And which countries are they going to accept the visitors from without having to put them into quarantine, unless we're talking about the quarantine or safe haven holidays that I mentioned earlier. The key to the reboot of our tourism sector is our three key source markets, which are China, Korea, and Japan, which together for the last several years have accounted for more than 50% of our inbound arrivals. And it's key to find a way to get those markets moving again. I was on a webinar a few days ago which focused on the reboot of China outbound tourism, and it was based on a survey by Delivering Asia and hotel networks in Thailand. And the majority of people that were interviewed in that survey, which was of qualified travelers from the first tier cities in China, most of them were wanting to travel, and 45% of those that wanted to travel were saying that Vietnam was their #1 favored destination. So there is demand there even now. So it's going to be, when is it going to be safe to take people from those countries? And also, when do we reinstate visa exemptions? I think the initial recovery is going to be driven by the younger, more affluent, mobile population, who have shown that they're not afraid to travel. They're not afraid to go out and to socialize. They've been the ones that in many countries have been breaking the lockdown and going out in groups and mixing in groups and not wearing masks and everything that we've been recommended to do. They've been prepared not to do it because then they don't seem to be afraid of the COVID epidemic. I think we'll see more FIT travel, individual travelers initially, and in the case of China, they're calling that revenge travel. They've been cooped up for so long, they can't wait to get on a plane and go somewhere. And as I've said, China is a major source market for us. Business travelers will start to re-emerge, because if they're making investments in a country, and the appetite for investments in Vietnam is still very high, even during the first 4 months of the year, we've seen significant new investment commitments, but ultimately people want to come and kick the tires. So we've got to find a way to, again, allow or reinstate travel for serious business people and investors, and also people that work here who are still stranded overseas in places like Australia and the UK and Europe, who have been unable to get back. That will also be driven by the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement, which has been ratified by the European Union and is due to be ratified by Vietnam at the upcoming National Assembly meetings, and also by the TPCP. So I've already mentioned the outbound China and the survey that was done. So I don't think I need to dwell on this particular slide. But the traditional period for China travel is August, and the national holidays during October. So I think the target for us is to be able to get a lot of those people in here in the October national holidays. I'm going to stop there. I'm happy to take questions, but before I do start, just a word about Grant Thornton. We are an international organisation. We're represented in 140 different countries. We provide a range of advisory, tax advisory, auditing and business process solutions like any of the big international accounting and auditing firms. And we're focused very much on the middle, what we call the middle market, or the owner managed businesses. We do have clients who are multinationals, but they're more for the specialized services. And we continue to grow at a healthy rate, or at least until this year. Although I have to say that in Vietnam, where we were the second international accounting firm to be licensed in 1993, our business seems not to have been badly impacted at the moment, but I think our biggest issue is going to be collecting from clients, because everybody seems to be facing, most businesses are facing financial stress of one form or another. But in Vietnam, we have 2 offices, Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. We have 13 partners and 260 staff, and we have revenues close to $6 million US. So thank you very much for listening, and look forward to the questions later after Mr. Chuck has given his presentation.
Thank you, Ken, for a very detailed presentation there on the tourism and hospitality. As Ken has just mentioned, we're now going to hand over to Nguyen, who is the Associate Director of CBRE Hotels, and will be specialising in that area.
Hello, everyone. I hope you all can hear me well. As Peter has introduced, my name is Thuc from CBRE Hotels Vietnam. So we are basically the advisory and investment brokerage arm of CBRE that is specialized in hospitality real estate. And I'm very honored to be here today with Mr. Ken to give some updates about Vietnam tourism and hospitality market. So I think in Ken's presentation, we have had very useful insights about the tourism market of Vietnam. So in my presentation, I'm going to touch a little bit more on the hotel sector, hopefully, from the perspective of hotel developer and owners. So in my first slide, basically this is a summary of the milestones of Vietnam's fight against COVID-19. I think in Ken's presentation, we somehow have touched that already. So I'm just going to go really quick here. We all know that Vietnam had the first few cases by the end of January from tourists traveling from Wuhan. And by the end of January, we have been very quick in suspending Sorry, just a moment. Just one moment, please.
You might need to go in this mode. And it's better this way. Okay. Yeah, sorry.
All right.
You move it past if you put it on the big screen. So,
Oh.
Yeah, this is why.
So put it like this.
Yeah.
So, sorry, just one moment. So yeah, sorry for the technical glitch. This is something that we might see very often with, COVID, social distancing, and the rise of webinars. So where was I? So by January, we suspended all flights from China, and in early March, with the outbreak happening in Korea, we suspended all flights to and from Korea as well. And by the middle of March, Vietnam suspended entry of foreigners from some European countries. And by the end of March, basically, we suspended all international flights and all foreign entry. And that has impacted the hotel market a lot. From April the 1st to April 15, we had a nationwide social isolation period. And from what you can see on the slide over here, we have successfully flattened the curve during this period, which was extended until April 22nd for big cities like Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City. By 23rd of April, basically a lot of businesses have been resumed. And gradually, restaurants and flights and trains and buses are now running as normal. I think right now we don't have karaoke or the clubs yet, but probably after we have more days of no new cases, probably the government may lift that as well. So by 7th of May, just 2 weeks ago, local airlines are now able to lift the social distancing measures, which basically means during the isolation period, they cannot have the middle seat occupied, and the capacity was only maximum 80%, but now it's back to normal. Even though we have some imported cases recently from the carrying back of some overseas Vietnamese, but they are now in quarantine camps, so probably that won't impact too much. In this slide, basically these are some stats about the impact of COVID-19 on the tourism sector. In Q1 of this year, the number of international tourist arrivals dropped by 18%. But if we look at the month of March alone, which is when a lot of international flights were suspended, that decrease is very scary at 68% only in March. And Vietnam Airlines estimated that their revenue in this year could drop by $2.1 billion US. And tourism revenue, basically the same stories, will have a significant drop in this year as well. In this slide, I would like to deep dive into the top source markets for Vietnam's tourism. So it's interesting if you look at the charts on the right that even though for source markets like China and Korea, which saw a very huge drop of 32% for China and 26% for Korea in Q1. Russia source market actually saw an increase in volume in Q1 of 14%. Basically, that can be attributed to a very good January, where we see the volume of international tourist arrivals to Vietnam reach a record high level. Even when we take into account the whole first quarter, including February and March as well, Russia still registered a very high increase in volume. In March, when a lot of flights were already canceled, we still see an increase of 5% for the Russian market. And across different cities in Vietnam, from the statistics from various tourism authorities, we saw that Nha Trang is the city that saw the biggest plunge in tourist arrivals. So basically, the drop in Nha Trang was like about 52%, while Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh it is from 36 to 42%. And in the next slide, I'm basically going to talk about more on the hotel performance in the biggest cities of Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh in the past quarter. Yeah, so here we see a snapshot of the hotel sector in the first quarter. Yeah, I hope everyone is seeing the slides properly. Let me just quickly go to that slide. So in terms of supply, in Q1, the supply level in Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi hasn't changed much. So we have about 35 4- and 5-star properties in Hanoi and 50 upscale properties in Ho Chi Minh City. The Hanoi supply level is still quite a lot less than Ho Chi Minh City. That's why in the past few years we have seen that it's more positive in terms of performance for Hanoi market rather than Ho Chi Minh City. In terms of demand, so as I mentioned earlier, the drop of international arrivals to both cities, which is more drastic in Ho Chi Minh City, has impacted the hotel market a lot. So that translated to a decrease in ADR of about 12% in Ho Chi Minh City, but for Hanoi is minimal at just about 7%. I'm sorry. In terms of occupancy, we saw that the drop in both cities is around the same, of about 28 percentage points. However, because the ADR level saw a bigger drop in Ho Chi Minh City, the revenue per available room in Ho Chi Minh City had a more severe impact of a drop of about 50% compared to the same period of last year. And on this slide, basically, I would like to look at the month of March alone and how revenue per available room has changed month by month in both cities of Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. So we saw that, so basically the line here represents the volume of international arrivals to Vietnam, and the darker green color represents Ho Chi Minh City. The lime green represents Hanoi, and as we can see, the level in March for both cities is at a historic low level. So I think it's universally agreed that the retail sector and hotel sector are among those that were hit the most by COVID-19, and a lot of hotel business right now, given the RevPAR of just about $20 per available room per room per night. They are now having a lot of struggles to stay open, and they have gone from laying off staff to consider closure as a more practical approach, because they cannot achieve break-even point if they stay open when there's no guests at all, especially the smaller hotels. So in this slide, I would like to discuss how the government has put in place measures to counter the impact caused by COVID-19. So first of all, let's talk about the fiscal policy. We have, I think, if I'm not wrong, it's a resolution 41 or 42, where the government has had measures like deferral in tax payments, as well as in land use fees for developers and industry players of those industries that were affected by COVID-19. Real estate is among those industries. And on the monetary policy side, we have rate cuts by the State Bank of Vietnam. We have referential credit support for the affected businesses, which definitely will include hotel business as well. On the incentives for the employers, we have concessional loans of 0 interest from the Bank of Social Policies. Basically, this helps the employers who to pay workers who has to be temporarily suspended from work for 3 months. And more measures related to the hotel industry would be electricity bill reduction. There was, if I'm not wrong, packaged that are very preferential for tourism accommodations. On the tourism side, we also see that the private sector is trying to ramp up the recovery strategy once COVID is contained. So right now, just recently, Vietnam Airlines has resumed domestic flights back to near normal capacity. And by June, I think that we basically go back to normal. While for international flights, we think that by June, some commercial flights will resume as well. But that is subject to the situation in some other countries as well. And we saw that Bamboo Airlines and Vietjet have come up with many unlimited domestic flight pass, which basically means that buyers can pay for future flights in the present, like in a package, at a very low rate. So this hopefully will help to boost the demand for the aviation industry and consequently the hotel industry. So on this slide, we are trying to compare the measures put in place by other countries in the regions as well, which will support the hotel market. So it's a bit more here, but no worry. We can send you the materials later after this webinar. We saw that in Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore, there have been fiscal policies as well as monetary policies in place as well to help the affected industries, including hotel. And what's interesting here is that we see that for Malaysia and Singapore, they even have training courses for the hotel and tourism staffs. And I think this is very beneficial to the industry, because right now we think it's the time that the hotel owners will hibernate and rethink about renovation and how to recover post-COVID. But at the same time, a lot of their staffs are being suspended from work or working hours reduced significantly. So with training courses that are promoted by the government and hopefully, I guess, be free for those tourism staff. And I think that's one of the biggest issue for Vietnam's tourism and hotel sector, in that we have abundant labor, but not a lot of them have gone through professional skill training. So if Vietnam put in place training programs such just like what happened in Malaysia and Singapore, we think that would be very good for the recovery period. And next, on this slide, I'm going to discuss about the rebound of hotel sector post-COVID. And a lot of us are wondering right now which segment of guests will be the first to recover. And I think it's no surprise that domestic leisure travel, we think, will be the first to recover post-COVID, given that right now social distancing and lockdowns are still present at a lot of countries around the world. And international flights are not resumed yet. So Vietnam probably will be among the first countries to resume international flights. So in Vietnam, we have a program, Vietnamese People Travel Vietnam, which will be put in place in June by the Ministry of Sports, Culture and Tourism. And given that now the discretionary income level in Vietnam has been reduced a lot post-COVID, and the limited number of international flights probably in Q2, we think that the demand for domestic travel will be boosted a lot. And next, we think will be the segment of corporate transient or corporate guest travel for business trips. And in fact, we have seen that happening already, like in the north in Hanoi, with a lot of with some Samsung business travelers, helping some business hotels in Hanoi. So basically, Samsung has some charter flights to Hanoi still during this time, and that has helped somehow with hotels in the midtown area of Hanoi. And furthermore, once we go more into the recovery phase, and when containment of COVID-19 has been more successful in neighboring countries, we expect that international leisure travel will gradually come back. But definitely that will take some time. Last time, with what happened in the SARS epidemic in 2003, it took like about 7 or 8 months for the occupancy level and for the international tourists to return as normal. I think with COVID being a bigger crisis, we may not get back the normal level, but probably what a lot of people are calling the new normal. But definitely after some time, international guests will return to Vietnam, probably through arrangement such as travel bubble, which I can talk a bit more later. And in June, probably we will expect to see some international flights already. As Ken has mentioned, right now there is a pent-up demand for travel among the young, probably middle-class tourists. And with travel bubbles like between Vietnam and some other countries who are successful in containing COVID, international segment will recover soon, which will be beneficial to countries inside a bubble in the beginning. And the MICE guest segment, which is meetings, incentive, conference and events, we think will be the last to recover, or very slow to recover, because this kind of travel will depend a lot on the corporate budget. But given COVID, I think corporate budget has been cut to very minimal level right now. And through the COVID period, people have seen that virtual events like what we're doing right now through Click Meeting or through Zoom, through other systems can be very good and cheap way for people to communicate across countries. And the rise of virtual events will basically impact the event industry and the MICE industry probably in the longer run as well. So the next slide. So basically on this slide are some new trends that we think will emerge post-COVID. So first is wellness tourism. Wellness has been a buzzword in the region and in Vietnam recently, but definitely after COVID, it will receive even more attention from developers as well as from tourists and vacation goers. So through this crisis, people are now putting a lot of priority on wellness and hygiene level. So if before wellness is only a preference, now it's a big priority for tourists globally and in Vietnam as well. And before with the trade dispute between US and China, and with what's happening through this crisis, basically we see that people around the world are having a retreat from globalization. So we think in the future, localism or regionalism will be on the rise, especially when we don't know for sure when international flights between Vietnam and various countries will resume. That may happen gradually, like we may open flights with Korea and China first, and maybe flights between Vietnam and Europe or the US will be open a lot later. So we'll see a trend of regionalism. And within Vietnam, we think that micro holiday will be a big thing in the near future and in the midterm as well. Because previously, a lot of people will talk about, Da Nang, Nha Trang, or Phu Quoc, which is very good locations, but normally you have to access those by flights. Micro holiday means now locations where you can just drive over. For example, Ho Tram, Phan Thiết, and Đà Lạt in the south, and Mộc Châu, Sapa, or Ha Long in the north. Will receive more attention from tourists, and with that, the volume to hotels over there will increase compared to the pre-COVID level. And resorts, we think, will be a new thing that a lot of tourists will now would like to try out as well, because right now people will be very reluctant to go out, to the street shops or to the street restaurants. If those resorts have extensive facilities, let's imagine those like the Vinpearl resort on Hon Tre Island in Nha Trang, where we have a theme park, we have the spas, we have the all the Vinpearl Phu Quoc, where there's safari, basically everything in one place. I think family guests will really prefer those kind of extensive facilities resort. And next, like I mentioned earlier, in navigating the road to recovery, we think that travel bubble will be a common way to for countries to gradually resume cross-border travel. So basically, travel bubble is an arrangement between countries that have the similar success in containing COVID, whereby probably the citizens of those countries can travel relatively freely among countries in the bubble, while travelers from other countries outside the bubble probably will have to be put under quarantine, let's say when they travel to Vietnam. So for an example, if we have a bubble with, let's say, Thailand, Vietnamese travelers and Thai tourists can travel freely. But the US maybe is lower in containing COVID, so US tourists, even if the flights between Vietnam and US is resumed, once they travel to Vietnam, they will still have to go through a quarantine period. So right now we have seen that some countries in Europe, like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, have already formed a travel bubble for to boost the tourism sector and the hotel sector in those countries. And a lot of talks have been going on in other European countries as well, like Germany and Austria are expected to have something like that on 15th of June. And New Zealand and Australia in the Southern Hemisphere have also formed a travel bubble. And not finalized, but we expect to see that soon. They call it the Trans-Tasman travel bubble, which will help the tourism and hotel owners in those countries a lot. So, so probably these are very beneficial in gradually open borders between countries. But a cons is that it can be very volatile, because once there's a resurgence of COVID cases in a member country within the bubble, the travel corridor will just be closed right away. So the success of this kind of arrangement will be dependent on countries' level of capability in tracking the COVID containment situation in other countries in the bubble. And in this slide, basically is the note of caution. So right now, even though Vietnam has been very successful, in containing the virus, we are among probably the first countries to stop social distancing and resume domestic flights and going business as usual already. But some case studies from China and Korea will serve as very good examples for us not to be so relaxed yet, because even though Korea, they have gone for quite some time without new cases. Recently, just on 8th of May, they had a new COVID cluster, which is related to a bar in Itaewon area in Seoul. And now the country has again reintroduced isolation and shutdown measures and contact tracing of all the cases related to that patient. So basically, it's not time for us to be relaxed yet. We still have to be vigilant of what of the risk that COVID may resurge in Vietnam. So hotels right now, even though they can open already and continue starting to get domestic tourists to arrive, but I think basically hotel owners and operators will have to watch out and have measures in place in case there may be a new cluster in Vietnam and social isolation will be reintroduced again. Okay, so this is my last slide already. Basically, here we're trying to have some list down the items that hotel owners can pay attention to from the short term to mitigate the pains caused by COVID-19. They can leverage the government stimulus package and various government incentives to reopen, to financially assist their staff. And they should probably think about be creative around promotion packages, like they should get partner with maybe the airlines like Vietnam Airlines or Vietjet to come up with interesting packages to lure the tourists back to their hotels. And given the volatility of the crisis, flexible cancellation we think should be an attribute of the package, so that tourists are more confident when they book those packages. And right now, hygiene and safety enforcement is a priority, not just from the government, but also a big concern for tourists as well. So those hotels who can have some certificate or who can showcase that they have a more stringent cleaning routine, will be able to attract tourists better. And in the transition from mitigation to adaptation, we think that hotels can focus in the early phase of recovery on the domestic segment. So, for example, a lot of hotels in the upscale segment, previously they only target international tourists. Now they have to rethink their marketing strategy and social media strategy, for example, so that domestic guests is now more available and can help to drive the volume for them. And as I mentioned, travel bubble should receive focus as well from hotels, like probably those countries from Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, which have more, I think, a better level of success in COVID containment, we will be the first to come back to Vietnam. So marketing strategy to target those tourists right after flights are resumed has to be devised right now from now on. And in the longer run, developers of hotels and hospitality complex, we have to rethink the expansion plans. So like I said previously, Da Nang and Phu Quoc and Nha Trang, basically big and tier 1 cities, have received a lot of attention. Now, through this crisis, we see that some tier 2 cities like Dalat and Phan Thiết actually can fare very well during health crises like this. So probably developers should look at those locations as well. And in the long run, if Vietnam has depended a lot on China and Korea source markets, it's time for tourism authorities as well as for hotels at a micro level to think about how to diversify their source markets, be it international versus local, be it leisure independence tourists versus group tourists. There's no correct answer, and there's no one-size-fits-all approach. We think it's totally up to each hotel, up to their situation to devise and to think what would be the correct balance mix so that they won't depend too much on any single or any few source markets. And definitely, hotels should have a budget for precautionary measures as well when crises like this may happen again in the future. So it's the new normal that we all have to deal with. And with that, it's the end of my presentation. I would like to hand over to Peter, who will continue with the Q&A.
Okay, thank you, and thank you again for a very detailed presentation. Some of the earlier questions have been answered as indeed you've gone through that your presentation. One of the points though that was being raised was what did you see the effect being on Airbnb through COVID as opposed to the sort of more formalized hotel industry?
Right. So I would take this question first. So I think Airbnb or short-term rentals, private short-term rentals, were impacted significantly through COVID. So in the month of March, in cities like Ho Chi Minh City, we saw that the government actually has some official document to say that short-term rentals should be closed during the isolation period. Even though hotels at that time were still allowed to open, even though a lot of them chose to close by themselves. But short-term rentals have to be closed during such period. And with short-term rentals, one thing is that I think they depend a lot on international guests. So, you know, the format that I see, at least in Ho Chi Minh City, has been that some young people, they rent out, you know, like an old apartment in the central area of the city. They add in like some interior design and some cool touch to the apartment, make it look a lot better. And then they rent out on channels like Airbnb or Luxstyle. And basically that attracts a lot of international guests because the rate is a lot cheaper than, you know, the traditional normal hotels. But the location can be just as good, like in the center of the city. And like young travelers especially are very drawn to such concept because they can still have, you know, the location, but they can also have a more local experience compared to staying in a normal hotel. But with COVID happening, I think no more international tourists. So that's like a big cut to demand for private short-term rentals. And now there's a stronger focus on health and hygiene. So I think a lot of people, they may now consider to add a little bit more money to go for hotels, like 4-star hotels or 5-star hotels with, you know, promotion packages, because they can be more assured that the cleaning routines in those hotels will be definitely better compared to like private rentals.
I think that takes us, thank you, and it sort of takes us on to another question, which is how do we actually see hotels operating in the rebound? You mentioned it partially in your presentation, but on a day-to-day basis, how are they going to actually sort of be working when we get back to normal, which is a further question that we have.
Well, I think it's going to accelerate this move to digitalization. I have to say, I'm not been a big fan of it myself, partly because of my age and the generation I grew up in. But you know, late last year, I went on a business trip with a client to Tokyo, and everything when you got there was just automated. So, you know, you put your passport into a machine, you put your credit card in, you paid for your room nights, and the key was delivered, and off you went. You didn't speak to anybody. And I thought, God, this is terrible. But now I say to myself, this is what the future travel is likely to look like. You know, there's going to be a lot less interaction. So, you know, you can check into a hotel without having any personal contact. You can do facial recognition. You can get into the elevator. You don't have to actually touch a button. And you can go into your room by facial recognition as well. So, you know, that whole check-in experience is likely to change quite dramatically. And in places like Japan, where they've got these robots, I mean, room service, you get a robot delivering your meals. If you really
China
want to take in China,
Yeah.
take it to those extremes. So I think it's an opportunity for hotels to look at it, and also I think it's an opportunity to satisfy the future demands of a lot of guests.
I just want to add on, I
Yeah.
totally agree with Ken. I think going digital, even though right now hotel industry has gone digital a lot, because basically we are booking a lot of tourists are booking their hotel stay through OTA, the online channels like Booking, Agoda. But like Ken said, I really like the concept that you can self-check-in at hotels. But I used to go to this hotel chain called Citizen M, which is very prevalent, I think, in the West, and they have some hotels in Asia as well, whereby you just go in, you scan some barcode on your phone to the check-in machine, and you can be automatically checked in by yourself. You don't need like a hotel stop at the check-in counter at all. But definitely, I think that that may not be very relevant for the super luxury or upscale sectors, because definitely with such segments of guests, they will still require some level of assistance and customized approach. But at least I think for like three-star plus hotel, I think that's the way to go in the future. And back to your question about how hotels going to cope with right after the crisis. From what I observed in Thailand, the government, like the tourism authority, they came up with some certificate like program whereby they will certify those hotels after checking from the tourism authority. Those hotels that can pass the test, like how the cleaning of rooms are being done, and how the disposal of waste, where the mask and cleaning gel is available, etc. So I think that's something that Vietnam can look at as well.
Yeah, so it goes back to the code of best practice conduct that I mentioned in my presentation, which should be certified, and there should be severe penalties for hotels that are not compliant.
So one of the questions again is are we going to return to a normal, or are we going to return to a new situation? Probably with 30 years experience in Vietnam.
Yeah, well,
normal?
What's normal? Yes, so it makes you think back. I've been thinking back to the days when I first arrived in 1989. Yeah, it's difficult to know actually. A lot of people are saying, well, the industry's been around a long time and it's going to return. Sure, it's going to return to normal, the old normal. I'm not convinced that that's going to be the case, and if it is, it's going to take quite a long time, 2 to 3 years to get back there. So I think there will be more of a new normal, but I'm struggling to figure out what that new normal is likely to be. But as I say, I think we'll see changes in the way people deliver their service and deliver their product.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. I think this crisis is unprecedented, and it's a lot of things are still uncertain. So it's very hard right now to make any, forecast about how the new normals may look like. But if I may, I think the occupancy level may return to the pre-COVID level after some time. We may not know exactly how long yet, maybe 1 year, maybe 2 years, but definitely it will return. But the preferences of tourists definitely have been changed, and also, the hotel landscape basically will be drastically changed after this crisis. So digital trends may become more prevalent, at least for the not so upscale segments, and people will be more focused on wellness trends, like what I mentioned in my slides. And I think Vietnam has focused a lot on mass tourism to drive its tourism and hotel market in the past 4 years. We've seen the volume of tourists having double-digit growth for a few years, and that's like among the top growth in the region. So after this crisis, definitely our country, Vietnam, we have to rethink the strategy for tourism development. Maybe less focus on mass tourism, with more focus on the guest segments that are probably more focused on hygiene and cleaning standard, who are willing to pay more and who are willing to stay for a longer period of time.
So I think it'll drive occupancy to branded residences, to condotels, to resorts with villas, where people can have more self-containment and not be worried about, having to mix with people all the time. So, but at the end of the day, I've got a feeling that's going to be fairly or relatively short term, because people have got very short memories, as we've seen from lots of different incidents and things that have happened globally, and after 6 to 12 months, people just tend to forget and get on as what they consider to be normal. But I certainly think in the next 12 months, I think resorts with villas and self-contained apartments, branded residences, are going to probably perform better.
One of the questions that's just come in has been about the government measures to support the industry. Has there been much sort of appraisal as to how successful that's been, and is there anything that we should or could be doing to push for further measures?
So we've conducted a survey as Tourism Advisory Board and Grant Thornton, together with Private Sector Committee Number 4 on VN Express, and I think the measures that have been taken by the government, whilst they're to be applauded and certainly do help, the impact on a lot of the tourism and hospitality sector has been actually very, very minimal. A lot of the stakeholders, they can't get these loans from the banks because they don't have assets to pledge as security, or the banks are worried about their ability to repay, which is understandable from a banking point of view, which is why we've recommended to the government that there should be a government guarantee scheme for loans to stakeholders in the sector. So they're finding it very difficult to get loans. Reduction in VAT when you've got, or deferment of payment of VAT when you've got zero revenue, actually doesn't help at all. And deferment of paying personal income tax for your staff when they're all on furlough and getting very minimal wages does not actually add much benefit to these companies. So I think there needs to be a little bit of a rethink around how that's being handled. But we have to recognise that the government's got very limited budget other than by printing money. We understand that why they don't want to print money, because that just leads to inflation. So I think it's trying to take sensible decisions that will have impact on the sector.
Also, tourism and business travel overlaps so much, holiday tourism. One question is, which is so much at the moment, is crystal ball gazing. Do you see when the realistic opening of the airlines may be able to actually facilitate sort of business travel coming back into Vietnam, as well as part of the sort of more holiday tourism program? Cool.
Sorry, just a moment. So yeah, I think flights will, like I mentioned, will be resumed in June.
Mm-hmm.
There have been some news around it, but probably for it to be really back to normal, it will take longer time, because maybe Vietnam has contained COVID well, but some other countries may not. So from what I read, probably in June, the first few flights will be to transfer like foreigners staying in Vietnam back to their country. So it's like a one-way flight and not the other way. Because for the other way, probably we have to put them into quarantine. So June, I think, is still not the time that people can relax all those measures yet.
But don't underestimate the number of expat business people that, for one reason or another, were stuck overseas and are still stuck overseas. I've got a number of clients, friends that are in Australia, in Europe, that are basically stuck, and they need to get back to run and operate their business. Many of them are general directors or legal representative. They didn't leave powers of attorney because they thought they were coming straight back, and so their businesses are being severely hampered by not just by COVID, but the fact that they're not able to get back in. So.
And at the same time, Peter, I think there's a pent-up demand for corporate travel, because like at our company, we have a lot of clients and partners who are based in like Korea, China, or Japan. Like they have projects in Vietnam, but now because of the flight suspension, they cannot go to meet their partners. They cannot go to see the site or the land. And they are telling us that once the flights are resumed, they will go back right away and update us more on their progress. So we think that probably maybe up to June, once the containment is more apparent, definitely once flights are resumed, there'll be quite a strong demand in the early phase from countries, especially those that invested a lot of FDIs into Vietnam, like Korea, Japan, China.
One final question we've just got time for. It's sort of got two parts. One is, what can we do about the sort of promotion of the success of Vietnam and actually getting the word out greater? There's still a lot of feeling abroad that Vietnam is in a much worse situation than it is. And I think it was you, Ken, who mentioned about the sort of sales promotion for the young Vietnamese. So a sort of marketing question, really, with two. How do we promote the country as being one that's relatively safe to be returning to at the moment, and certainly going forwards, and also what promotions may be able to take place internally to help with that attraction as well?
Sure. I think for like young travelers, which will definitely be the first kind of international travelers to return to Vietnam, social media is being used a lot nowadays. So I think Vietnam Tourism Board has some campaigns on, let's say, Instagram or Facebook. I think it's called Vietnam Now. Probably, those posts from Vietnam Tourism Board or from the tourists can show that daily lives have been resumed in Vietnam. So there can be a focus on, showing the daily aspects, not just beautiful photos about a beach or, the hotel, but what's happening on the street daily. so that prospective tourists from abroad can see that we are now business as usual. And once they get the flights, they will book to return and visit.
But I've seen it. I've seen an uptick, and I'm very pleased to have seen it on social channels that people are really starting to talk about the success of Vietnam in containing COVID. And I think the government needs to be doing more, to blow their own trumpet, excuse the expression, but they deserve to be able to blow it. So I think it's down to all of us really, through our own channels and business channels and government channels and tourism advisory board channels, is really to get the message out and make sure the whole world knows how successful Vietnam has been containing.
Thank you. And again, on behalf of everybody, I'd like to thank Ken and Chuck for the presentations and clear answers to the questions. Finally, I would just like to make a couple of points for BBGV. There will be a quiz night here in Ho Chi Minh on the 5th of June, so feel welcome to sign up for that. And we do have our AGM approaching for those members wishing to take part as well. So thank you all for listening and contributing to the webinar through your good questions. Thank you very much indeed.